Further speakers. The Honourable Susan Carter.
Madam President, free speech is one of our most important rights and one which we should always be anxious to protect. Similarly, the right to worship freely and to associate together. There is much in the spirit of this legislation which is commendable. The devil, as always, is in the detail, and so on balance I indicate that we will be opposing this legislation, both the constitutional amendment itself and the referendum bill which seeks to entrench that amendment. There are many different approaches as to how we best protect rights, and our opposition to this particular bill should not be construed as opposition to the protection of the rights it enumerates. The rights to believe freely and worship as we wish, to speak freely, to have a free press, and to assemble peacefully are all important freedoms which we continue to enjoy as free citizens of a free and democratic society. As, of course, is the continuing right to petition Parliament. And I note in passing that this is a right which is currently being exercised by constituents of both the Honourable John Ruddock and of mine, and I invite you all to visit the Legislative Council petition page and sign the petition protesting the cuts to palliative care. But to return to the subject matter of this legislation, one of its challenges is that it assumes that the only threats to our freedom come from legislation, and that by limiting the power of the legislature, these freedoms will be protected. Of course, we know that this is not the case, and indeed one of the great strengths of the common law is the way in which it has served as a flexible and vigorous defender of our rights through the centuries and fended off attacks on our liberties from executive and legislature alike. Any legislative statement of our rights, constitutional or otherwise, limits the ability of the common law to serve as a protector of our rights. And while I have great sympathy with the intention of the mover, that if we are to list these rights in legislation, they should be protected from meddling by future parliaments, this entrenchment brings its own problems. The American citizens, fresh from a revolutionary war, had one view of what was meant by the right to bear arms. This looks very different in American streets and schools and colleges today, but it is still entrenched in their constitution. Ossifying rights does not always protect them, or indeed protect the people who they were designed to protect. And indeed, legislating rights does not always achieve the desired outcome or give a primacy to the rights which have been legislated. In Victoria, a state which has their own Charter of Rights, which has been referred to by my colleague, tremendous statement of rights in legislation. Overridden in the case of Clubb and Edwards, in which Clubb, a sidewalk abortion counsellor, was convicted after handing a leaflet to a young woman approaching a clinic which could have easily been refused. And she was convicted because an additional right in the legislation which imposed that prohibition was seen to override the right that was in the Charter of Rights. So we get into very complex territory when we start legislating and thinking about hierarchy of rights. And this is entirely despite the fact that Victoria has a very elegant statement of freedom of expression as a human right in its Charter of Rights. And of course, one of the issues of rights that we see in that example, and we see in a number of the other examples which has been given today, is the difficulty of balancing rights. I believe very strongly in the right to freedom of speech, but there are limits on what I can say. There are limits about what I can say about goods that I might sell to protect others. There are limits on what images I can show because they may well be abusive. There are limits on whether I can say something about another person's character because that would be defamatory. And these are all limits that we accept as part of living together in society with each other. As John Donne once said, no man is an island, and we do not have this complete command of rights at our own disposal. We need to think about how they relate to each other. And the rights that the member has put forward are a very good statement of rights, but they cannot be seen in a society where we live with each other as absolute statements of those rights. In fact, we will have a debate in this House tomorrow about the conversion practices prohibition ban bill. There are many people who see some of those provisions as directly impacting on religious freedom. Yet we will decide as a parliament where the balance comes between protections which are thought to be necessary and limitations on the freedom to express religious beliefs. These are decisions which are very difficult and need to be approached very thoughtfully and very carefully, but need to be made if we are to live together as members of a society, especially as a pluralist society where there are many different views that need to be balanced. To legislate less legislation is somewhat paradoxical, but it is perhaps what we need to do to live together well. This bill is commendable, but in some ways misunderstands the nature of a democratic society and its processes. There simply are no absolute rights which trump all others. If I was going to attempt to suggest one, I would attempt to suggest it is the right to be respected by other people. And the respect that we offer to one person necessarily involves in some way a voluntary limitation of our own rights of expression in some circumstances. To declare that I believe is to remove freedom. Democratic processes are a constant evaluation, a re-evaluation, a rebalancing of rights and freedoms. What is really important is that we all remain committed to this process, we remain engaged in this dialogue, and by our constant restatement of the importance of these rights, we recognise and support the true source of these rights, which is never given to us by a government in a constitution, but which may be recognised by a government in a constitution, is never given to us by a parliament in law, but may be recognised by a parliament in law, because the true nature of our rights is because we are free citizens of a free society living together, and that is the best guarantee of our freedom of rights.